The woman looked as though the entire weight of the world rested on her shoulders. Her coat was too thin for the cold evening, her hands trembled as she clutched a faded canvas bag, and her eyes carried the kind of sadness that no amount of sleep could erase. Every passenger waiting at the crowded train station avoided looking at her, pretending not to notice the silent tears gathering in her eyes. I almost did the same. But something deep inside me refused to let me walk away. I stood up from the only empty seat nearby and quietly offered it to her. I thought it was nothing more than a simple act of kindness. I had no idea that the words she would say next were about to change everything I believed about strangers, fate, and the incredible power of compassion. Before we continue, if stories about kindness, hope, and second chances touch your heart, please take a moment to like this video, leave a comment telling us where you're watching from, share this story with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to Ripple of Kindness so you never miss another inspiring journey. She hesitated before accepting the seat, as if she had forgotten that people could still be kind without expecting anything in return. Slowly she sat down, holding her worn bag tightly against her chest. For several moments she simply stared at the floor. The noise of the station faded into the background as I noticed the exhaustion on her face. She looked no older than 50, yet life had added decades to her expression. Then she lifted her head, looked directly into my eyes, and quietly said that I was the first person who had spoken to her kindly in 3 days. Those words struck me harder than I expected. 3 days without a single kind conversation. 3 days of walking through crowds while feeling completely invisible. I suddenly realized how easy it is to overlook someone else's pain simply because it doesn't interrupt our own routine. The train was delayed, giving us more time than either of us expected. She never asked for money or sympathy. Instead, she slowly began sharing pieces of her life as though she had been carrying a heavy stone in her heart for years and could no longer bear its weight. She had once owned a small flower shop with her husband. It wasn't a business that made them rich, but it was enough to build a peaceful life. Every morning they arranged colorful bouquets together, believing that flowers carried messages people often struggle to say aloud. They celebrated anniversaries, welcomed newborn babies, and comforted grieving families through their simple work. It was a humble life filled with purpose. Then everything changed within a single year. Her husband suffered a sudden heart attack and never returned home. Medical bills swallowed their savings, and the shop eventually closed. The apartment they had spent decades paying for was sold to settle debts. Friends who once promised lifelong support slowly disappeared. Even distant relatives stopped answering her calls. One tragedy became another until she found herself carrying everything she still owned inside the faded bag resting beside her feet. As she spoke, I couldn't stop thinking about how fragile life truly is. We spend years building something beautiful, believing tomorrow will always look like today, until one unexpected moment rewrites the entire story. Looking around the busy station, I wondered how many people carried invisible battles just like hers. How many smiles hid unbearable grief. How many strangers desperately wished someone would simply notice them. The announcement board flashed another delay. Most passengers groaned with frustration, but neither of us seemed to care anymore. Time had become something different. She admitted that earlier that afternoon she had considered giving up completely. She wasn't talking about finding another place to sleep or searching for another job. She meant giving up on life itself. She had wandered into the station because it was warm and crowded enough that no one would notice another lonely face sitting in the corner. Then, just before hopelessness completely consumed her, someone offered her a seat. Those words stayed with me. I realized how unbelievably small actions can become life-changing moments without us ever realizing it. I wasn't a hero. I hadn't solved her problems. I had simply stood up from a chair. Yet somehow that tiny decision interrupted the darkest day of another person's life. I offered to buy her dinner from a nearby café while we waited. At first she politely refused several times, embarrassed by her circumstances. Eventually she accepted only after I promised that one day she could repay the kindness by helping someone else who needed it even more. For the first time that evening, a faint smile appeared across her face. It wasn't a smile of happiness yet, but it was enough to let hope breathe again. Over warm soup and fresh bread, her story continued. She told me about her daughter who had moved overseas years earlier. Misunderstandings, pride, and distance had slowly built walls between them until communication completely stopped. She carried an old photograph folded carefully inside her wallet, opening it every night before trying to sleep. Despite everything, she never stopped believing that someday they might find each other again. Hope, she said, was the only possession nobody could take away. Her words reminded me of my own life. I had spent years rushing from one responsibility to another, constantly believing I was too busy to slow down. I often ignored messages from old friends, postponed visits with family, and convinced myself there would always be another opportunity. Sitting beside this stranger forced me to question everything. Success suddenly seemed meaningless if it left no room for compassion. Before our train finally arrived, I asked whether she had somewhere safe to go that night. She quietly admitted she didn't. Instead of saying goodbye, I contacted a local community organization that provided temporary shelter and employment assistance. Fortunately, they had one available room. Volunteers arrived within the hour, treating her with warmth and dignity instead of pity. As they prepared to leave, she turned toward me once more. She told me she would never forget the seat I had offered because it wasn't really the chair that mattered. It was the reminder that someone still believed she deserved kindness. Sometimes people don't need miracles, she explained. Sometimes they only need one person willing to remind them that they still matter. Months passed before I heard from her again. Life returned to its normal rhythm, yet I often thought about that evening whenever I entered another crowded station. Then one afternoon a handwritten letter arrived in my mailbox. Inside was a photograph of the same woman standing in front of a beautiful greenhouse, smiling brighter than I ever imagined possible. The shelter had helped her find work caring for plants at a local botanical garden. Her love for flowers had returned, and with it, her confidence. Even more incredible, the organization had helped reconnect her with her daughter. They had spoken for hours through video calls before finally arranging a reunion. The years of silence had ended not because the pain disappeared, but because both hearts chose forgiveness over regret. Reading her letter brought tears to my eyes. She ended it by writing that every flower blooming around her reminded her that broken seasons never last forever. Winter always feels endless while we're living through it, but spring quietly prepares itself long before anyone notices. She thanked me not for saving her life, but for reminding her that hope was still alive when she could no longer see it herself. From that day forward, I began noticing people differently. I smiled more often at strangers. I checked on neighbors living alone. I called family members without waiting for special occasions. I discovered that kindness rarely changes the entire world overnight, but it completely changes the world of the person standing right in front of us. And sometimes, that's exactly where miracles begin. If this story has touched your heart so far, please like this video, share it with someone who needs encouragement today, leave a heartfelt comment, and subscribe to Ripple of Kindness. Your support helps these true-to-life stories of hope reach people who may desperately need them. Special request, before this story ends, please leave a comment with the words, "Kindness still matters." Your message may encourage someone silently struggling today. Whenever I remember that cold evening at the station, I realize the greatest opportunities in life rarely arrive wearing expensive clothes or carrying impressive titles. Sometimes they arrive looking tired, forgotten, and invisible. Sometimes they sit quietly in the corner, hoping someone will notice them before hope disappears forever. We may never fully understand the battles another person is fighting, but we always have the power to offer a smile, a seat, a conversation, or a moment of genuine compassion. Those small acts often become the turning points people remember for the rest of their lives. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson of all, that the smallest ripple of kindness can travel farther than we ever imagine, reaching hearts we may never see, healing wounds we may never know existed, and reminding us that even in a world filled with hardship, hope continues to bloom wherever one person chooses kindness over indifference.